Hello class, it's Mr. Miller. So the purpose of this video is to very quickly go through all of the videos that we've talked about or that you've seen, all the topics that we've talked about in Unit 1, which is all about the formation of life. So far, and this is going to be very quick, okay, so if you want details, go back to each individual video. But this is just going to be a quick summary of everything. We're going to tie it all together, but we're not going to go into a deep dive into any one of these. We're just going to cover the surface stuff, hit the bullet points, and kind of summarize everything we've talked about in this unit. So the first thing we talked about were atoms. Now, everything in the universe is made up of atoms. They're not the smallest things in the universe, but everything that exists, all the matter in the universe, I should say, that exists is made up of atoms. And atoms are made up of even smaller parts, protons, neutrons, and electrons. That's it. In the nucleus, we have protons and neutrons, and going around the nucleus, we have electrons that are negative. Okay. These atoms can bond together. So if I have atom 1 and atom 2, these atoms can make what we call a bond. Okay. And when two or more atoms bond together, the entire thing is called a molecule. Now, you and every other living thing on the planet, even bacteria, which are too small to see without a microscope, are just made up of different molecules put together. Okay? So these molecules will bond with other molecules to make bigger molecules. And then those bigger molecules will bond together with other molecules to make even bigger molecules, and so on and so on and so on, until they make up you and every other living thing. We talked about how chemical reactions, what chemical reactions are. And chemical reactions are just simply breaking these old bonds between other atoms and making new bonds with new atoms. So if I break the bond between 1 and 2, and I make a new bond between 2 and 3, I have now performed what we call a chemical reaction. That's all chemical reactions are. They're just breaking bonds between old pairs of atoms and making new bonds with new pairs of atoms to make new molecules. That's all chemistry is. Now, there are these things that can speed up that process and make that process happen faster. So when you have atom 1 and atom 2, and they're separate, it requires, they're not separate, and they're bonded, it requires a certain amount of energy to break this bond. Just like if you had any two things that were attached and you needed to separate them, it would take a little bit of energy to do it. So you have to put energy into breaking the bond, but then when you do, energy also comes out. So if you put a little bit of energy in to breaking the bond and you get a lot of energy out, or you can put a lot of energy into the bond and get just a little bit out, it takes energy, is my point, okay? And the amount of energy required to make a chemical reaction happen, in other words, the amount of energy it takes to break this bond between these two guys and create a new bond between these two guys to make a new molecule, the amount of energy you have to put into that process is what we call activation energy. Now, there are other molecules that act as what we call catalysts. And these things are called enzymes. Enzymes act as catalysts. And catalysts speed up chemical reactions. They make them happen faster. And the way that they make them happen faster is by lowering the amount of energy needed to make that chemical reaction happen. In other words, enzymes act as catalysts by speeding up chemical reactions by lowering the amount of energy it takes to make that chemical reaction happen, which we call the activation energy. So by reducing how much energy we need to put in to make this whole process happen, it can therefore happen faster and with less effort. So your body uses a lot of enzymes all the time. And there's two things that can affect how well the enzyme works. We did this by testing it in a lab. And the two things that can affect how well an enzyme can speed up a chemical reaction are temperature and pH. So these two things can affect how well this enzyme can do its job and make this whole process happen. If the temperature and the pH are not where they should be, this will either happen slower and take more effort, or it won't happen at all. So that was enzymes. Then we talked about biomolecules. Okay, so we learned that atoms bonded together make molecules. Those molecules bond to make bigger molecules, so on and so forth. And there are four kinds of molecules, four categories of molecules that your body and every other living thing are made up of. And they are carbs, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And we call these four, we call them biomolecules. The molecules of life. So you and every other living thing are made up of molecules that fall into one of these four categories. Now they all have some similarities. They're all made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. These three are 1, 2, 3. And nucleic acids are made up of they have an extra one, nitrogen. So we learned how it really only takes four atoms, four different kinds of atoms put together in different combinations to make up every part of you. And that's carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and then nitrogen in the case of nucleic acids. Okay. All right, and then, well, let me go back to here. So we focused primarily on these two here, proteins and nucleic acids. Now, proteins have thousands of jobs in your body. Anything that happens in your body is somehow related to a protein making it happen. It's involved at some point in the process. Most everything. Okay? And your body's constantly making them all the time. But the way that they make them is from the nucleic acids, which are DNA and RNA. These two nucleic acids work together to help create these proteins so that they can do the thousands of jobs in your body that need to get done. And not only do proteins do thousands of jobs, but they also control your traits. Remember, traits are things like hair color, eye color, body type, all sorts of things. Everything about you, literally everything about you is a trait. Your bone density, how big your heart is, all of these things are controlled by proteins, which are made from DNA and RNA. And the process that DNA and RNA use to make these proteins is called protein synthesis. So let me write that down. So DNA and RNA work together. So we start off with DNA, and the information in DNA is rewritten into a strand of what we call mRNA. The M stands for messenger. Because it's delivering a message from DNA to the cell so that it can make the protein. And this RNA is then translated into amino acids, which are just molecules, smaller molecules, that when put together make up the larger molecule, which is a protein. So this process of this first stage of protein synthesis, where DNA is converted into messenger RNA, is what we call transcription. The second step, where mRNA is used to then make amino acids, is called translation. then the amino acids are put together to make up the protein, which controls your traits. And that is a very quick summary of all of Unit 1.